Most citizens believe they know the answer. The Constitution governs India. After all, every institution derives its authority from the Constitution. Every office exists because the Constitution created it. Every branch of government traces it. Most citizens believe they know the answer. The Constitution governs India. After all, every institution derives its authority from the Constitution. Every office exists because the Constitution created it. Every branch of government traces it. Legitimacy back to the constitutional text. And yet, history presents us with a puzzle. Many countries have had constitutions, some possessed constitutions filled with promises of liberty, equality, and justice. Yet, those promises never became reality. Why? Because constitutions do not govern themselves. The constitution cannot conduct an election, cannot hear a constitutional challenge, cannot implement a welfare scheme. The Constitution cannot coordinate national security. The Constitution cannot enforce its own authority. Only institutions can do those things. Which brings us to the central argument of today's episode. Constitutions are blueprints. Institutions determine reality. The Constitution may distribute powers equally. Institutions do not exercise them equally. Some institutions become more influential than their constitutional footprint suggests. Others become less influential despite possessing immense constitutional authority. Most citizens believe they know the answer. The Constitution governs India. After all, every institution derives its authority from the Constitution. Every office exists because the Constitution created it. Every branch of government traces its legitimacy back to the constitutional text, and yet, history presents us with a puzzle. Many countries have had constitutions, some possess constitutions filled with promises of liberty, equality, and justice. Yet those promises never became reality. Why? Because constitutions do not govern themselves, cannot conduct an election, cannot hear a constitutional challenge, cannot implement a welfare scheme. The Constitution cannot coordinate national security. The Constitution cannot enforce its own authority. Only institutions can do those things. Which brings us to the central argument of today's episode. Constitutions are blueprints. Institutions determine reality. The Constitution may distribute powers equally. Institutions do not exercise them equally. Some institutions become more influential than their constitutional footprint suggests. Others become less influential despite possessing immense constitutional authority. The story of every republic is therefore the story of institutions acquiring, exercising, and defending power. And nowhere is this more fascinating than in India. So today, let us investigate a deceptively simple question. Who actually governs India on an ordinary day? Let's call it the great constitutional illusion. There is an assumption so deeply embedded within modern political thought that most citizens never pause to examine it. That constitutions govern nations, that constitutions limit power. We are taught that constitutions preserve democracy. And in one sense, all of these statements are true. Yet they are also profoundly incomplete because history presents us with an uncomfortable fact. Many nations have possessed excellent constitutions and terrible governments. Many dictatorships have possessed constitutions filled with promises of liberty. Many failed states have possessed constitutional texts that appear admirable on paper. The Soviet Union possessed a constitution. Numerous military regimes have possessed constitutions. Authoritarian states routinely maintain constitutions. If constitutional texts alone determined political reality, these nations should have been among the freest societies in human history. They were not. The question therefore becomes unavoidable. If constitutions are so powerful, why do countries with remarkably similar constitutional promises produce radically different outcomes? Why do some democracies flourish while others decay? Why do some republics become prosperous while others remain trapped in instability? Why do rights exist in practice for some citizens and remain theoretical for others? The answer lies in understanding the distinction between constitutional architecture and operation. A constitution creates institutions. Institutions create reality. And this distinction may appear subtle. In truth, it is the single most important idea in constitutional governance. Imagine for a moment that India woke up tomorrow with a constitution entirely unchanged. Every article remains exactly where it is. Every provision remains intact. Every right remains protected. Every amendment remains preserved. Yet, the Supreme Court ceases to function. The Election Commission stops conducting elections. The civil services stop implementing policy. Political parties stop organizing representative government. The Cabinet Secretariat stops coordinating administration. Would governance continue? The answer is obvious. The text would remain. The constitutional system would collapse. This reveals something profound. The Constitution is not self executing. The Constitution cannot enforce it, cannot interpret itself, cannot defend itself. The Constitution cannot govern. Only institutions can perform those functions. The deeper question before us is therefore not what the Constitution says. The deeper question is who actually exercises power in the name of Constitution. And to answer that question, we must first understand the truth that every successful republic eventually learns. Power rarely remains where constitutional theory places it. Power migrates, power adapts, power concentrates, power follows competence. Power follows legitimacy. Power follows institutions capable of exercising it effectively. This is the hidden history of every constitutional order. It is certainly the hidden history of India. Why constitutions never govern countries, institutions do. Now let's talk about institutions that actually govern India. If constitution alone governed nations, constitutional history would be simple. Law would produce power. Authority would flow exactly as written. Institutions would merely execute instructions. Reality has never worked this way. Every constitutional republic eventually discovers a fundamental truth. Is only the visible constitution. Alongside it emerges another constitution, an unwritten constitution, a living constitution, a practical constitution, a constitution composed not of articles and clauses, but of institutions, habits, incentives, traditions, personalities, and power relationships. This practical constitution often determines national outcome far more than the written one. To understand India, therefore, one must distinguish between constitutional theory and constitutional reality. What powers exist? Constitutional reality asks who actually exercises them. This distinction explains why students of constitutional law and students of political power sometimes arrive at very different conclusions about the same republic. The lawyer studies authority. The constitutional statesman studies influence. The lawyer asks what an institution may do. The statesman asks what an institution can make happen. And there are not always identical questions. The Constitution of India distributes power across multiple institutions: parliament, executive government, judiciary, federal units, independent constitutional authorities. Yet, over time, certain institutions acquire influence beyond what their formal constitutional position might suggest. Others lose influence despite retaining impressive constitutional powers. This process is neither accidental nor uniquely Indian. It is a universal feature of political life. Institutions expand when they solve problems. Institutions expand when they acquire legitimacy. Institutions weaken. Institutions expand when society increasingly depends upon them. This is how constitutional evolution occurs, not through amendment alone, but through institutional adaptation. The story of modern India can therefore be told through five institutions: the Supreme Court of India, the Prime Minister's Office, the Cabinet Secretariat, political parties, and the Election Commission. Together, they reveal how power actually moves through a republic. Let's talk about Chapter 1, the Supreme Court, the guardian that became an arbiter. When the Constitution came into force on 26 January 1915, the Supreme Court was unquestionably important. But importance and dominance are different things. The founders did not create a judicial republic, they created a parliamentary democracy. With constitutional safeguards, the judiciary was expected to interpret law, protect rights, resolve disputes, maintain constitutional boundaries. Yet, history rarely obeys original expectations. Over the following decades, the Supreme Court gradually became one of the most influential institutions in the Indian state. The transformation did not occur overnight, nor did it occur because judges simply decided to acquire power. The story is far more complex. Yet history rarely obeys original expectations. Over the following decades, the Supreme Court gradually became one of the most influential institutions in the Indian state. This transformation did not occur overnight, nor did it occur because judges simply decided to acquire power. The story is far more complex. The court expanded because historical circumstances repeatedly posed constitutional questions toward judicial resolution. Each constitutional crisis strengthened judicial significance. Each institutional conflict increased public attention. Each challenge to constitutional limits elevated the role of court. The first major battles involved property rights and constitutional amendments. Could Parliament amend any part of Constitution? Were there limits to constitutional change? Who would decide? Parliament or the court? These questions culminated in one of the most consequential constitutional confrontations in Indian history. Keshavananda Bharti. The case is often remembered for the basic structure doctrine. Its deeper significance lies elsewhere. It fundamentally altered the relationship between constitutional institutions. After Keshavananda Bharti, Parliament remained powerful, but it was no longer constitutionally supreme. The Supreme Court acquired a new role, not merely interpreter, not merely adjudicator, guardian of constitutional identity. The implications were enormous. For the first time, an institution had claimed authority to determine whether constitutional amendments themselves remain constitutionally valid. Notice what happened. The constitutional text remained largely unchanged, yet the practical distribution is power shifted. An institutional transformation had occurred. The constitution had not moved, power had. Then came the emergency. Few periods have shaped institutional psychology more profoundly. The emergency revealed both institutional strength and institutional weakness. It exposed vulnerabilities, it tested loyalties, it forced different choices. Most importantly, it permanently altered how many Indians viewed constitutional safeguards. After the emergency, public faith increasingly shifted towards institutions perceived as capable of restraining concentrated power. The judiciary became one of those institutions. History was again distributing influence. Then came the revolution of public interest litigation. The significance of PIL is often misunderstood. It was not merely a procedural innovation, it represented an institutional expansion. Suddenly, access to constitutional remedies widened dramatically. The court entered areas previously regarded as belonging primarily to administration and governance. Environmental protection, prison reform, human rights, corruption, public accountability, administrative failures. The court was no longer merely resolving disputes brought before it. It was increasingly shaping public policy. Whether one views this development positively or negatively is not our concern today. What matters is the institutional consequence. The Supreme Court acquired influence beyond what a simple reading of constitutional text might predict. This teaches a crucial lesson. Institutions do not acquire power solely through constitutional provisions. They acquire power through historical opportunities. Now let's talk about chapter 2, the institution that barely exists in the constitution. Now consider a remarkable paradox. The Prime Minister's office is arguably the most influential institution in contemporary governance, yet it occupies surprisingly little constitutional space. This should immediately attract our attention. If constitutional text alone determined political importance, the PMO should be relatively insignificant. Yet the opposite is true. Why? Because modern governance rewards coordination, and coordination generates power. The Indian state is among the most complex governing systems on earth. Hundreds of departments, thousands of agencies, millions of employees, countless decisions, an immense administrative machine. Someone must connect these parts. Someone must establish priorities. Someone must resolve conflicts. Someone must determine direction. The institution performing this coordination function naturally becomes influential, not because the constitution commands it, because practical governance requires it. The rise of PMO illustrates one of the most important principles of institutional power. Connecting the greatest number of actors often becomes the center of gravity. This pattern is visible throughout history. that coordinates information usually gains influence. The institution that allocates attention usually gains influence. The institution that determines priorities usually gains influence. The PMO gradually became all three. This transformation accelerated during moments of national challenge, wars, economic crisis, security threats, major reforms. Periods of uncertainty tend to increase demand for centralized coordination. Centralized coordination tends to increase institutional influence. Influence eventually becomes power. Power eventually becomes expectation. Expectation eventually becomes tradition. And tradition eventually becomes institutional reality. Thus, an institution only lightly described in constitutional text became one of the principal engines of governance, not because the constitution changed, because governance changed. Now let's talk about the Cabinet Secretariat, the Republic's invisible nervous system. Most citizens rarely discuss the Cabinet Secretariat. Many could not explain its role, yet this institution reveals a deeper truth about modern states. Visibility and importance are not the same thing. Indeed, some of the most critical institutions operate almost entirely outside public consciousness. The Cabinet Secretariat exists to coordinate, to connect, to monitor, to synchronize, to ensure that government functions as a system rather than a collection of isolated departments. Imagine the state as a human body. Political leadership may represent the brain, individual ministries may represent organs, but coordination functions as the nervous system. Without coordination, information collapses. Without information, decisions collapse. Without decisions, governance collapse. The significance of the Cabinet Secretary therefore lies not in public visibility but in administrative community continuity. Governments come and go, political slogans change, electoral mandates change, coalitions rise and fall, yet the machinery of governance must continue. Citizens will still require services. National security still requires management. Economic system still requires provision. The state must remain operational. This continuity depends upon institutions rather than personalities. It is one reason why states often appear more stable than governments. Governments are temporary, states endure, and institutions like the Cabinet Secretariat help explain why. Now let's discuss political parties. India's most powerful unwritten institutions, perhaps no institution better demonstrates the distinction between constitutional text and political reality than the political party. Political parties occupy surprisingly modest constitutional territory, yet it is impossible to understand India without understanding them. Consider a simple question. When citizens enter a polling booth, are they primarily voting for constitutional institutions or are they voting for political organizations? The answer is obvious. Political parties perform functions the constitution alone cannot perform. They recruit leadership, organize political competition, develop policy agendas, mobilize public opinion, structure legislative behavior, create governing coalitions, allocate political opportunity. In theory, members of parliament exercise independent judgment. In practice, party structures significantly shape political behavior. The constitution created representative institutions. Political parties determine how these institutions function. This makes parties extraordinarily influential. Indeed, one could argue that much of modern governance occurs through institutions that the constitution never fully anticipated. Political parties have become the operating system of democratic politics. Without them, representative government would struggle to function. Yet, because they operate partially outside constitutional design, they create new questions. Who governs the party? Who selects candidates? Who determines internal priorities? Who controls political incentives? These questions may not always appear constitutional. In reality, they are central to constitutional governance because power frequently enters constitutional institutions through political parties, and whoever controls entry often shapes outcomes. Now let's discuss the Election Commission, the power of trust. Some institutions govern through force, others govern through resources, a few govern through legitimacy. The Election Commission belongs to the third category. Unlike military institutions, it commands no armed forces. Unlike revenue authorities, it controls no major financial resources. Unlike legislatures, it passes no laws. Yet, its influence remains immense. Why? Because democratic legitimacy depends upon public confidence in electoral integrity. The Commission derives power from trust. And trust may be the most underestimated form of power in constitutional politics. When citizens accept election results, when candidates accept defeat, when governments transfer authority peacefully, they are demonstrating faith in institutions. This faith cannot be legislated, it must be earned. The Election Commission therefore illustrates another principle. Institutional legitimacy can become a national asset. Indeed, trust accumulated over decades may prove more valuable than powers granted on paper. Because institutions ultimately govern through public beliefs. The moment that belief disappears, formal authority often proves insufficient. And this is why constitutional governance depends upon something deeper than legal rules. It depends upon institutions capable of maintaining confidence across generations. The republic survives because citizens continue believing that its institutions deserve obedience. That belief is among the most powerful forces in political life. Now let's discuss who governs India on an ordinary day. There is a habit in democratic politics. Whenever a major event occurs, citizens instinctively ask who made a decision, which minister approved it, which judge delivered the judgment, which politician announced the policy. The research is always for an individual. We seek a face, a name, a leader, a villain, a hero. Yet, republics are rarely governed by individuals alone. The deeper reality is more complicated. Modern states are ecosystems. Decisions emerge from networks. Authority travels through institutions. Information moves through bureaucracies. Policies pass through layers of review. Laws encounter administrative interpretation. Judgment require enforcement. Elections require organization. Behind every visible decision stands an invisible architecture. To understand constitutional governance, therefore, we must stop asking who governs India in theory. We must ask who governs India in practice, not during elections, not during constitutional crisis, not during moments of national emergency, but on an ordinary Tuesday. A completely ordinary day reveals more about power than extraordinary events ever can. Because extraordinary events distort reality, ordinary days reveal it. Let us therefore follow the Republic through a single day. Not a hypothetical republic, the actual Indian Republic. And let us observe where power resides. 8 a.m. of the day, the Republic awakens. Across India, nearly 1.5 billion citizens begin their day. Markets open. Schools function. Courts prepare to sit. Government offices activate. Trains move. Ports operate. Financial systems process transactions. Electricity grids continue functioning. Water systems operate. Telecommunications networks remain active. Most citizens never think about these systems. Their reliability makes them invisible. Yet, governance begins here. The first lesson of constitutional power is that governments spend far more time preserving normalcy than producing transformation. The greatest achievement of a state is often not dramatic reform, it is preventing disorder. Every ordinary morning is evidence of institutional success. When citizens can predict tomorrow, institutions are functioning. When citizens cannot predict tomorrow, institutional breakdown has often begun. The preservation of ordinary life is one of the most extraordinary achievements of modern government. Let's talk about 9 a.m. Inside the Prime Minister's office, while much of the nation continues its routines, another process unfolds. Files move, briefings arrive, assessments are prepared, reports are reviewed, National priorities are evaluated. Some matters concern economic growth, others concern diplomacy, others concern national security, some concern welfare implementation. The public often imagines power as a command: issue an order, receive compliance, problems solved. Reality is different. Most governance is coordination. The PMO's greatest source of influence is not constitutional text, it is informational gravity. Information flows toward institutions capable of making decisions. The more information an institution receives, the more influential it becomes. The more influential it becomes, the more information it attracts. This creates a cycle. Information generates influence. Influence generates information. Over time, institutions become powerful because they become indispensable. The PMO is one such institution, not because it governs alone, but because modern governance increasingly flows through it. This is a recurring pattern in political history. Power often follows information. Let's talk about 10:30 a.m. of the day. The Supreme Court convenes. Elsewhere in New Delhi, another institution begins its work. A constitutional challenge is listed. A question concerning federalism appears before a bench. A dispute regarding executive authority is argued. A matter involving individual liberty is heard. At first glance, these appear to be legal disputes. In reality, they are often disputes about power. Who may redefine authority? Every constitutional republic must answer these questions. And every constitutional republic eventually entrusts some institution with the responsibility of providing answers. In India, that institution is the Supreme Court. Yet, notice something important. The court does not collect taxes. The court does not administer ministries. Its authority depends largely upon legitimacy. When a judgment is delivered, compliance often follows because institutions accept the court's constitutional role. This acceptance is itself a form of power. Indeed, some of the most important forms of power are invisible. The court's influence derives not merely from constitutional provisions, but from a broader national belief that constitutional disputes require constitutional resolution. Without that belief, even the most carefully reasoned judgment becomes ineffective. This reveals another constitutional truth. Institutions govern through legitimacy before they govern through authority. Let's talk about 12 p.m. of the day. Inside the Cabinet Secretariat, by midday, hundreds of decisions across government require coordination. A ministry seeks approval, another requests clarification. An implementation challenge emerges. An interdepartmental conflict requires resolution. A policy requires synchronization. Most citizens never witness these processes. They occur outside television studios, outside political speeches, outside public controversy. Yet, governance depends upon them. The public often celebrates leadership. The state depends upon administration. This distinction matters. Leadership provides direction, administration provides execution. History remembers leaders. States survive because administrators ensure continuity. Every successful republic eventually develops institutions capable of functioning regardless of political turbulence. The Cabinet Secretariat represents one such mechanism. Its importance lies in reliability. A republic cannot function if every administrative process depends upon political intervention. The state requires systems. Institutions create systems, and systems create continuity. Let's talk about 2 p.m. of the day. Political parties enter the picture. Now, another set of institutions becomes active. Political parties. A strategy meeting occurs. Legislative priorities are discussed. Electoral considerations are evaluated. Public messaging is defined. Candidate selection is debated. Coalition relationships are managed. Most constitutional textbooks devote extensive attention to legislatures. Far less attention is devoted to political parties. Yet in practice, parties often shape the behavior of legislatures more than constitutional theory acknowledges. This is not unique to India, it is a characteristic of modern democracy. Political parties organize power, they aggregate interest, they create incentives, they translate public sentiment into political action. And because they perform these functions, they become indispensable. Imagine elections without parties. Imagine government formation without parties. The constitutional framework would remain. The practical system would become almost unworkable. This is why political parties represent one of the most influential institutions in democratic life. Not because the constitution grants them extraordinary authority, but because modern democracy depends upon them. Power frequently belongs to institutions that solve coordination problems. Political parties solve one of democracy's greatest coordination problems. 3:30 p.m. of the day, the administrative state. Across India, thousands of bureaucratic decisions are being made. Licenses processed, taxes and accessed, infrastructure monitored, welfare programs implemented, security evaluations conducted, regulative decisions issued. Most citizens interact with the state not through parliament, not through the Supreme Court, not through the Prime Minister. They interact with institutions through administration. This is crucial observation. The lived experience of constitutional governance often occurs far from constitutional courts and legislative chambers. For many citizens, the state is encountered through administrative systems. This reality highlights a fundamental lesson. Constitutions may create authority, administration determines experience. A constitutional right means little if institutions cannot implement it. A welfare promise, a law, means little if institutions cannot enforce it. This is why state capacity matters. A weak state may possess excellent constitutional principles. A capable state transforms principles into reality. Now let's talk about 4:30 p.m. of the day. The Election Commission watches. Elections may not be scheduled today, yet the Election Commission remains active. Roles are maintained, processes are reviewed, compliance is monitored, procedures are evaluated. Institutional credibility requires constant maintenance. The public often focuses on election day. The integrity of elections depends upon years of preparation. This illustrates a broader principle. Institutional trust accumulates slowly and can disappear quickly. The Election Commission delivers influence from confidence. Citizens trust outcomes because they trust processes. Processes matter because institutions protect them. Institutions matter because democracies depend upon them. Trust, therefore, becomes a form of constitutional infrastructure. Just as roads facilitate commerce, trust facilitates governance. Without trust, institutions lose effectiveness. Without effective institutions, constitutional promises weaken. Without constitutional confidence, republics become fragile. 5:30 p.m. of the day, the invisible negotiation. As evening approaches, something remarkable becomes visible. No single institution governs India. The Supreme Court influences the executive influences administration, political parties influence legislatures, the Election Commission influences democratic legitimacy, bureaucracies influence implementation. Each institution possesses power, none possesses all power. This is genius of constitutional design. And simultaneously is permanent challenge. Every institution seeks influence, seeks relevance. Every institution seeks authority. The republic survives because no institution acquires complete dominance. Constitutional stability emerges from balance, not perfection. Balance. The history of republics is often the history of managing this tension. Too much concentration creates authoritarian risk. Too much fragmentation creates paralysis. Every generation must navigate the space between these dangers. India is no exception. Let's talk about 7 p.m. of the day, the end of an ordinary day. As citizens return home, the machinery of governance continues. Files remain under review. Judgments await compliance. Politics await implementation. Political strategies await execution. Administrative systems continue functioning. The republic does not sleep when citizens stop watching. Institutions continue operating. And this brings us to a profound realization. When citizens ask who governs India, they often expect a single answer. a prime minister, a parliament, a court, a party, a constitution. The reality is more complicated. India is governed by an institutional ecosystem, a constantly evolving network of authority, legitimacy, coordination, and execution. No single institution governs the republic. The republic governs itself through institutions, and those institutions derive their strength not merely from constitutional text, but from competence, legitimacy, tradition, and public confidence. The constitution created the architecture. Institutions animate the architecture. The constitution established the framework. Institutions transform framework into reality, and the constitution founded the republic. Institutions just govern it. The question is no longer whether institutions matter. The question is whether India's institutions will remain strong enough to carry the constitutional project into the next century. Because the future of a republic is ultimately determined not by the brilliance of a constitutional design, but by the quality of the institutions entrusted with bringing that design to life. Now let's talk about next part, the fate of republics. Why institutions decide national destiny. We have now arrived at the most important question of this episode. A question larger than India, larger than any government, larger than any political party, larger even than any constitution. What determines whether a republic survives? History offers many possible answers: military strength, economic prosperity, natural resources, technology, geography, leadership. Each matters. Yet, none fully explains why some republics endure while others decline. There have been wealthy states that collapsed, powerful states that fragmented, military strong states that lost legitimacy, brilliant leaders who presided over institutional decay. The deeper lesson of history is that republics do not survive merely because they possess power. They survive because they possess institutions capable of managing power. This distinction is fundamental. Power can be acquired quickly, institutions cannot. Power can be seized, institutions must be built. Power can belong to individuals, institutions belong to generations. And this is why the history of republics is ultimately the history of institutions. Now let's talk about chapter 1 of this part, the Roman lesson. Consider perhaps the most influential republic in human history, ancient Rome. When modern constitutional thinkers discuss republics, they often begin there, not because Rome was perfect, but because Rome confronted many of the same challenges that every republic eventually faces. The Roman Republic possessed elections, legislative assemblies, magistrates, checks on authority, complex constitutional arrangements. For centuries, these institutions provided stability. Rome expanded, prospered, accumulated influence. The institutions appeared durable. Yet, beneath the surface, changes were occurring. Power was concentrating, institutional norms were weakening. Political competition was becoming increasingly personal. Loyalty to institutions gradually gave way to loyalty to individuals. This transformation did not occur in a single year. It unfolded over generations. This is how institutional decline usually happens, not dramatically, gradually, almost invisibly, until suddenly what once seemed impossible becomes inevitable. By the time Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the Republic's crisis had already been developing for decades. The military remained powerful, the economy remained significant, the territory remained vast. Yet institutional balance had deteriorated. The lesson is profound. Republics rarely collapse because they run out of power. They collapse because the institutions lose the ability to regulate power. And once institutions weaken, even talented leaders often cannot reverse the process. History begins moving in a different direction. Now let's talk about chapter 2, the British lesson. Now consider a different example, the British constitutional system. Unlike many modern states, British possess no single written constitution, no single constitutional document, no equivalent of India's constitutional text. And yet Britain developed some of the world's most durable institutions: parliament, civil service, courts, cabinet government, political traditions, constitutional conventions. This should force us to reconsider a common assumption. If constitutions alone determine national success, Britain should have been disadvantaged. Yet, its institutional stability became one of its greatest strengths. Why? Because the institutions ultimately matter more than constitutional elegance. The British example demonstrates that nation may possess strong institutions even without a detailed constitutional text. The opposite is also true. A nation may possess a magnificent constitutional text and weak institutions. In such cases, constitutional promises often remain unrealized. The decisive variable is not merely constitutional design, it is institutional quality. The founders of modern India understood this well. They admired constitutional principles, but they also understood that principles require guardians. A constitution without institution is like a map without travelers. Chapter 3, The American Lesson. The United States offers another perspective. The American Constitution is among the shortest major constitutions in the world, yet it has survived for centuries. Why? Not because it answered every question, not because it anticipated every challenge, but because institutions evolved around it. Congress developed traditions, courts developed doctrines, political parties emerged, federal agencies expanded, informal norms supplemented formal rules. The Constitution provided a framework. Institutions supplied adaptation. This relationship between stability and adaptation is essential. A republic must preserve continuity, yet it must also adjust to changing circumstances. Institutions perform this balancing function. Strong institutions allow societies to change without collapsing. Weak institutions often force societies to choose between stagnation and instability. The survival of a republic therefore depends upon institutional resilience, not institutional perfection, resilience. The ability to absorb pressure without breaking, the ability to adapt without losing legitimacy, the ability to evolve without abandoning constitutional principles. Let's talk about the chapter 4, the post-colonial challenge. Now let us consider a more uncomfortable reality. Most post-colonial states emerge with constitutions inspired by democratic ideals. Some possess detailed constitutional frameworks, independent judiciaries, representative institutions, formal protection for rights, yet many struggle to achieve stable governance. Why? Because constitutional transplantation is easier than institutional construction. A constitution can be drafted within years. Institutions often require generations. Trust requires generations. Professional norms require generations. Administrative competence requires generations. Constitutional culture requires generations. This is one reason nation building is so difficult. Founding a republic is easier than sustaining one. Writing a constitution is easier than creating institutions worthy of it. The true challenge begins after the founding movement. The challenge is maintaining legitimacy across decades, across crises, across political transitions, across social transformation. This challenge never ends. Every generation inherits institutions. Every generation modifies them. Every generation is judged by what it leaves behind. Now let's talk about chapter 5, the Indian experiment. This brings us back to India. India's constitutional experiment is among the most ambitious in human history. A vast nation, extraordinary diversity, multiple languages, multiple faiths, multiple identities, immense social complexity, and yet the republic has endured, not flawlessly, not without crisis, but it has endured. Why? Because the institutions repeatedly adapted to changing circumstances. Courts have evolved, political parties evolved, administrative systems evolved, federal arrangements evolved, democratic processes also evolved. This adaptability is one of the Republic's greatest strengths. Indeed, one could argue that the history of modern India is history of institutions learning how to govern a civilization-sized democracy. The challenge has never been merely constitutional interpretation. The challenge has been constitutional implementation. How does one translate constitutional ideals into lived reality for more than 1 billion citizens? How does one balance liberty and order, rights and governance, federalism and national unity, accountability and efficiency? These are institutional questions. and institutions determine the answers. Now let's talk about chapter 6, the Republic's permanent dilemma. Every republic faces a recurring dilemma. It seeks strong institutions, yet fears concentrated power. It seeks accountability, yet requires effectiveness. It seeks liberty, yet requires order. It seeks stability, yet demands change. These tensions never disappear. No constitutional amendment eliminates them. No election resolves them permanently. No judgment settles them forever. They are enduring features of Republican government. The task of institutions is not to eliminate tension. The task is to manage tension successfully, continuously, legitimately. This is what separates durable republics from fragile ones. Fragile republics treat every disagreement as a crisis. Durable republics possess institutions capable of absorbing disagreement. Fragile republics depend upon personalities. Durable republics depend upon institutions. Fragile republics seek saviors. Durable republics cultivate systems. History consistently rewards the latter. Chapter 7 is about the future. As we look toward the future, debates about India will continue. Governments will change. Parties will rise and fall. Leadership will emerge and disappear. Policies will be adopted and replaced. Controversies will dominate headlines, then fade. Yet, underneath these events, a deeper story will continue. The story of institutions. Will they remain independent where independence is required? Will they remain accountable where accountability is necessary? Will they adapt to technological change? Will they preserve legitimacy? These questions will shape the next 50 years of the Republic far more than any single election. Because institutions determine whether constitutional promises remain living realities or become historical aspirations. The future of India therefore depends not merely upon economic growth, not merely upon political success, not merely upon military strength. It depends upon institutional quality. The quality of courts, the quality of administration, and the quality of democratic processes, the quality of constitutional culture, ultimately, the quality of the republic itself. We began this episode with a simple assumption that constitutions govern nations. History has led us everywhere. Constitutions matter profoundly. They provide vision, structure, authority, legitimacy. They establish the rules of the game. But constitutions do not govern. Institutions govern. Institutions interpret constitutional principles. Institutions protect constitutional rights. Institutions administer constitutional systems. Institutions transform constitutional promises into political reality. This is a central lesson of constitutional statecraft. A republic is not merely a document. A republic is a living ecosystem of institutions. Some invisible, some celebrated, some overlooked. Together, they sustain the constitutional order. The ultimate measure of a republic is therefore not the beauty of its constitutional language. It is the strength of the institutions carrying that language into the real world. Laws may be written in months. Institutions requires decades. Constitutions may be adopted in a single historic moment. Institutional trust must be on generations after generations. And when future historians evaluate the Indian Republic, they will not ask merely what its constitution promised. They will ask whether its institutions were strong enough, wise enough, legitimate enough to fulfill those promises. Because in the final analysis, constitutions create republic. Institutions decide their destiny. This is the constitutional story. This is the architecture of power. And this is the republic.